We've got a fascinating and really complex stack of materials today. It all focuses on a single powerful concept in Islamic scripture and law, mashq.
It's a big one.
A huge one. And if you're trying to understand the deepest fault lines in Islamic jurisprudence, our mission is pretty straightforward. We're diving into the doctrine of abrogation.
Which is, it's the idea where a later Quranic revelation is understood to replace or, modify an earlier ruling.
Exactly. It's maybe the most crucial and definitely the most controversial internal mechanism for understanding legal change within a text that's held to be eternal.
It really is the ultimate theological tightrope walk.
Yeah.
And, the idea doesn't just come from thin air. The mechanism itself is rooted right in the Quran.
Right.
We can look immediately to Surah 2, verse 106, which kind of gives the foundation for all of this. It says, "We do not abrogate a verse or cause it to be forgotten, except that we bring forth one better than it or similar to it."
So it establishes God's prerogative to legislate sequentially.
It's right there.
But right away, the complexity just explodes. You'd think there'd be a clear, definitive list of these revisions.
I hope so.
But instead, what we see is just radical scholarly disagreement. We've got classical figures like Shah Wali Allah arguing for as few as 5 cases.
Just 5.
Then you have others like Al-Suyuti, who lists over 20, and some of the really comprehensive classical lists go into the hundreds.
And that staggering range from single digits to triple digits, that's really the most crucial piece of this puzzle we have to unpack.
Yeah.
It's not just a statistic. It shows that the very foundation of determining which law is binding is deeply contested. The sources are clear. There aren't even 50 examples that are universally undisputed.
So how can a sacred law be binding if the experts can't even agree on which parts are, null and void?
That is the whole question. That's the essence of this deep dive.
Okay, so let's start by walking through the clearest, the least disputed examples. These are the shifts in ritual and social law that really demonstrate this evolution in action.
Right. It helps us understand the mechanism before we get into the heavy controversy.
So the direction of prayer.
The Qibla.
Probably the most famous ritual change, yeah. Early on in Medina, there was this initial flexibility. You have Surah 2, verse 115, which suggests a lot of latitude. It says, "To Allah belongs the east and the west. So wherever you turn, there is the face of Allah."
But that flexibility didn't last long.
Not at all. It was replaced by that famous directive in 2.144 commanding believers to fix their direction toward the Kaaba in Mecca.
And this shift is so critical because scholars don't just see it as a change of address.
No, it's a deliberate act of differentiation. It served as a spiritual test of obedience for that early community, and it signaled a definitive break, a move to unify their own identity, distinct from Jewish and Christian traditions.
Right. The other textbook example, which shows this profound social change, is the staged prohibition of alcohol.
Oh, yes.
And this wasn't some sudden sharp decree, which is fascinating. It shows a really sophisticated approach to managing a community. Absolutely. You can see the gradualism laid out so clearly. It starts in Surah 2.219, where the text just acknowledges, some benefit in intoxicants, but says the sin is greater. It's a soft warning.
Then you get the first actual restriction, Surah 4.43. The rule is basically, don't pray while you're intoxicated.
Which isn't a full ban, but it's a major restriction when you pray 5 times a day.
It makes it very difficult.
Very. And then finally, you get the definitive total prohibition. That's in Surah 5, verses 90 and 91. It calls intoxicants a defilement from the work of Satan and just commands total abstinence.
And when you look at that whole process, you can see why classical scholars, people like Imam al-Shafi'i, praised it so much. They called it pedagogical genius.
Because an abrupt ban would have been rejected.
Exactly. They reasoned that in a society where drinking was so deeply ingrained, a sudden ban would have caused massive social rejection. Yeah. It's just practical governance.
It is. It suggests that even divine law, in how it's implemented, has to account for human habits. We see a similar evolution with legal punishments too. Take the initial ruling for adulterous women.
Right, that's Surah 4, verse 15. Initially, it commands confining them to their houses until death or until, and this is the key part, Allah brings forth a new way for them.
It sounds like a temporary holding pattern. It's almost promising a future ruling.
Which is exactly what happened. That confinement was clearly abrogated when the new way arrived in Surah 24.2, which prescribed a fixed punishment of 100 lashes.
So it replaced a temporary measure with a fixed permanent penalty.
And then finally, we have an example of mercy, not severity.
Yeah.
The early nighttime devotion. It was extremely strict.
Oh, incredibly so. Surah 73 required standing in worship for half the night, or nearly 2/3 of it. That's an intense burden for any community.
Especially a new one facing constant threats. So later, Surah 73.2 gun comes and eases that requirement.
And it specifically mentions why. It notes that the community included people who were ill, or traveling, or working, and it allows them to just recite what is easy of the Quran.
This brings us right to the central theological tension. If God is omniscient, if he knows the future perfectly, why reveal a temporary or, a super stringent law only to cancel it later?
That's the billion-dollar question. Doesn't the very existence of NASC imply a change of plan? And the scholarly defense against that charge is complex. It really depends on what school of thought you're talking about.
Okay, let's start with the classical Sunni view, since they seem to be the most accepting of abrogation.
For them, NASC isn't a mistake. It's proof of divine wisdom and mercy. They argue that the earlier law wasn't wrong. It was just perfectly timed for that specific stage of the community's development.
So the later law is simply better suited for when the community is more ready.
Exactly. The process itself is seen as proof of God's omniscience in timing the revelations perfectly for human reception.
And within that Sunni framework, the sources point to an even deeper level of nuance, right? Where the legal ruling is gone, but the actual text stays in the Quran.
That is absolutely critical. It means that to know the law, you can't just read the text. You have to be an expert in jurisprudence to know which of the verses you're reciting are, for all legal purposes, dead.
The text is preserved for its historical value, but its application is gone.
Precisely.
That seems like a huge burden on the average believer. But what about the opposing view, the Shia perspective?
Well, most major Shia scholars, like Ayatollah al-Khoi, they reject the idea of intra-Quranic abrogation of rulings completely.
Completely.
They see it as incompatible with the idea of a perfect, contradiction-free Quran. They argue that accepting internal repeal would suggest a flaw, which they just can't accept theologically.
So, how do they explain the alcohol stages or the change in the prayer direction? They must have an alternative.
They do. Their solution is to distinguish between nask, which is repeal, and takhsis, which is specification or contextual application. For them, the earlier verses were never truly repealed. They argue the initial law was always intended to be temporary, or that its application was narrower than it seemed, and the later verse just clarified the scope or marked the end of a time limit.
So, if a verse looks like it was canceled, the Shia scholar would say no, it was just specified. The original verse was always perfect for its limited context.
You've got it. And that distinction, cancellation versus clarification, is everything. It's the difference between God changing his mind and the law being perfect all along.
And this more minimalist approach is mirrored by a lot of modern reformist scholars too, even in the Sunni tradition.
It is. They drastically reduce the number of accepted abrogations. They prefer to see conflicts as specification, or they connect it to context rules for Makkah were different from rules for the state in Medina.
Okay, let's pivot from the theological defense to the critical lens. What challenges do external critics, atheists and ex-Muslims, raise against this whole concept?
Well, the first and most powerful one is the charge of divine inconsistency. Critics argue that the divine timing defense sounds a lot like theological damage control.
Right. If God is timeless and all-knowing, why use a trial and error approach for something like alcohol prohibition?
It just looks too much like a human legislative process, responding pragmatically to social resistance. It looks like human compromise, not a fixed divine morality.
And we talked about this before. Why keep legally dead verses in the book?
Exactly. Critics say retaining those verses is profoundly confusing for the vast majority of believers who aren't trained scholars. If Surah 4.15 is legally null, why is it still being read? How does the average person know it was replaced?
It makes the sacred text inaccessible without a scholarly filter.
It does, and that leads directly to the epistemological uncertainty. If the experts can't agree if the number is 5 or 200, how can a lay believer ever know for sure what the binding law is?
That's the sharpest point of the critique, isn't it?
I think so. The radical disagreement means the system for determining God's law relies fundamentally on human interpretation, on consensus, on historical context, not on a perfectly clear divine decree. The authority shifts from the text to the scholar.
That is a staggering thought. But we have to address the issue that drives most of the modern debate about this.
The peace versus war verses.
Exactly. The claims that peaceful, tolerant verses were abrogated by later, more military ones. This moves the whole discussion from ritual into ethics and geopolitics.
And this debate centers almost entirely around the period after the Prophet Muhammad established a state in Medina. The classical tradition holds that certain Medinan verses, especially in Surah 9, superseded earlier, more conciliatory Meccan verses.
The main one here is Surah 9.5, the so-called sword verse. Kill the polytheists wherever you find them.
And alongside that, 9.29, which commands fighting the people of the book until they pay the jizya tax. Some classical scholars claimed these later verses abrogated dozens of earlier verses promoting peace.
And the list of what was supposedly abrogated is potent.
It is. It includes foundational expressions of tolerance, like no compulsion in religion, and to you your religion, to me mine, and even verses recommending kindness to non-hostile non-Muslims.
So the critical argument here is that this shift looks less like divine timing and more like, well, political evolution.
Exactly. The community in Mecca was weak, so patience and tolerance were necessary. Once they gained military and political power in Medina, the rules changed to confrontation. Critics say this suggests an adaptation to the circumstances of power.
But the classical defense is equally robust.
It is, and you have to understand it in its context. Scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah argue the peaceful verses were entirely appropriate for a persecuted minority. They weren't universally abrogated, just context-dependent. Once the Muslims became a state, they needed rules for warfare and defense.
So it's necessary legislation for statecraft, not a fundamental shift in morality.
That's the argument. And this is where the modern reformist view steps in again, trying to find a middle ground. Modern scholars largely reject the idea that the sword verse wiped out dozens of peaceful verses. They argue that 9.5 has to be restricted contextually, that it applied only to specific Arabian polytheists who had repeatedly broken treaties.
So by limiting the scope of abrogation here, they maintain that the peaceful verses, like no compulsion in religion, remain the general, overarching rule.
Precisely.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? The doctrine of abrogation, whether you accept it, minimize it, or reject it entirely. It's absolutely central to understanding how a complex religious tradition manages its own textual authority and legal change over centuries.
It really is the internal mechanism that decides what's still legally alive and what's just historically preserved. I mean, the whole debate over Naskh is essentially a struggle between maintaining textual consistency, the idea of perfect book, and acknowledging historical necessity.
That profound struggle brings us to our final provocative thought. If there was no early consensus among Muhammad's companions about which verses were abrogated, and if later scholars across history keep cutting the number down from hundreds to a few dozen to just 5, does this ongoing process reveal that the system for determining God's law is fundamentally a human interpretive tool, one that adjusts divine instruction to the evolving needs of the community?
That question really sits at the heart of legal theology and modern reform, a fascinating puzzle for you to consider. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.